Vern White, thank you for being here today. Having watched the Paris attacks last week, as a former police officer, was there anything that stood out for you?
In particular, I think some of the areas that I try to focus on and how are the police reacting to certain situations. If you look at the Paris attacks, the gunman went in with a specific goal and a cause, I guess, and that was to cause much damage, as much harm, and kill as many people as they could, as quickly as they could. They were very well planned and organized, and in that the attackers actually, in the case of the concert hall, actually had one person who was doing crowd control while the other was killing people. So the plan of the attackers, I think, was important for me, and then to watch how the police actually handled that. And we would call that in policing an active shooter scenario. And the response of the police, the first officers on the call actually responded as a result of their training when it came to active shooter scenarios. So they immediately entered the hall. Their job is to try and stop the shooters as quickly as they can to reduce the number of people killed. And in fact, a number of them ran into their death as a result. But that's why the training is so important, because to wait, unlike a hostage situation where you actually have an opportunity to negotiate, in an active shooter scenario, the shooters have no interest in negotiation. Their goal actually is only to kill. So your goal as a result is to do the same thing, kill them as quickly as you can. So I guess from my perspective, I looked at the importance of that active shooter training, the response to it, and how quickly they were actually able to engage. And probably as many people as were killed, it would have been many more. Those shooters would have run out of ammunition before they ran out of people to kill, I think, if the police hadn't acted as they had.
So how has the active shooter scenario been developed?
Columbine High School is probably the most well-known situation where the police behaved as if it was a hostage taking, but in fact was an active shooter. In that case, there are two students, for those who don't know, entered a high school. They had explosive devices brought in with them as well as firearms, and their goal was to kill as many people as they could until they killed themselves. The fact that the police barricaded the school and developed a hostage strategy as a result probably cost lives, or at least extended the scenario. The average active shooter only lives about 11 minutes from the first shot to the last shot. So the police have to realize that 11 minutes is extremely key to getting in there quickly. So after Columbine, in North America, a number of police agencies developed the active shooter scenario training to counter those school shootings. And in Canada, in fact, we had a number of school-based shootings as well that forced us into training our officers much more quickly. And in fact, we even took it beyond just training police services and police officers. We've also trained students, teachers, and principals as well, because they're the highest risk community we have from our last 20-year experience in Canada on the active shooter scenario. So that's probably where it was developed and has been rolled out pretty well worldwide since then.
So bringing that to an Australian context, was that active shooter scenario used in the Sydney siege at the Link Cafe?
It was used because in New South Wales and in other police agencies in the country, your tactical teams are trained in active shooter scenarios. Luckily, in the Sydney case, the actual individual inside did not become an active shooter immediately. He became an active shooter when something else motivated him, which was the escape of some hostages. And that's when he killed the individual in front of the window. I think it was the cafe owner. And the tactical team then actually rolled into an active scenario shooter response and entered the facility and took him out. Had he been an active shooter at the very beginning, it might have been a much different story. Might have been much more difficult for the police to respond. They wouldn't have had a tactical team on site. As I said, an active shooter typically from first shot to last shot's 11 minutes. Most tactical teams literally can't get out of the parking lot in the first 11 minutes of a call. So the importance of having frontline police officers trained in active shooting probably couldn't be any more important than it is today, right now, as we're dealing with a number of terrorist incidents. But in the case of the cafe, it was used, but it would have been a little different story, I think, if he had been an active shooter from minute one instead of hours later after he had already secured a hostage situation, really.
So what more can be done in relation to this in Australia?
Well, I know a number of police agencies have already started or acknowledged that they will begin in early 2016 active shooter training. I think that's a hugely important step, and in fact, New South Wales Police, I think, have already started the training. They've hit a couple of road bumps, I understand, but I think they'll get that back on track. So I think now what we'll see in Australia is a progressive and aggressive response to developing active shooter training across the country. But I think as well they have to focus some energy around making sure that they're educating the public at large, and in particular high-risk groups, on what active shooter training means. What does it mean? And as an example, what does it mean when you have an active shooter in your facility? It means actually that you're trying to find a way to live for 11 minutes. So going into a room, barricading a door with all of the furniture, because most active shooters look for open doors, open windows. They typically don't stand there trying to beat a door down. So barricading yourself in a room for that 11 minutes and hopefully give you the time to survive so the police can respond and take out the offender, I think as well, would be important. I know in Australia now that the staff on Parliament Hill, for example, are trained in active shooter training, which I think is very important. I think it's always a target and a risk. But I think now also identifying high-risk areas like schools, universities, colleges are important as well.
Sure. And what is your experience in this regard?
So when I was a police officer and a police chief in Canada, and I was with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police previously, I was involved in the tactical team when I was with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and we actually had trained in active shooter response. And then as a police chief, we had brought active shooter response training into our whole organization. So in Ottawa, 2,000 staff, all of our police officers were fully trained in active shooter response. In fact, you had to qualify and requalify every year in that technique. As well, all of our schools in the city of about 1 million people, all of our schools, students, teachers, and principals also were exposed to active shooter training. And in fact, we would run scenarios in the schools with them so they would understand. And we had a number of false alarm bomb scares in schools that allowed us to use that type of scenario training to clear the building, so get everyone into a safe classroom so that you can actually do a search. And we had a number of incidents where people had reported someone arriving with guns that also allowed us to use that scenario to quickly move into a facility, so you're not worried about kids running up and down the hall because they don't know what to do. The teachers, principals, and students all know the safest place for them to be is in a barricaded room, and they would respond accordingly. Very, very helpful when it comes to police response. Very difficult to identify bad guys, good guys running down a hall when you're in that facility and the place is packed with people. So you need those halls clear so that the identified targets are easy to pick up as well.
Vern White, thank you for sharing your experience with us.
Thank you very much as well.